let's talk a little bit about the foundational theory of the science of biology, the unifying theory of the science of biology, and that is the theory of evolution by natural selection. There are millions of species of living organisms sharing the planet with us right now, and our own species and all those other species seem to be pretty amazingly well adapted to the environments that we inhabit. There are also millions of species that lived on the earth in the past and are no longer with us. Why is there all of this diversity? There are a limited number of different habitats on the planet, and we have all of this diversity. How did all of these current species, the modern species, get to be here on the planet? And what happened to all of those ones that went extinct? Evolution, by definition, is a process through which populations of organisms adapt to their environment and is the means through which modern organisms, modern species, have descended from ancestral species, ones that lived in the past. So that's the basic idea behind evolution. And it's also change. Change in a population, change in a species that happens over time. One of the interesting and, in some ways, frustrating parts about talking about evolution is this notion that evolution is a theory, and somehow that diminishes its importance in science. Because there are people who want to discredit evolution as a theory, as an idea. They point out that, well, it's just a theory. Well, in science, pointing out that something is just a theory is pointing out how important and how well established that idea is. Because we don't call anything a scientific theory until it has been very thoroughly explored and researched and tested again. And we also don't call something a theory unless it is an explanation about a big idea that we have observed out there in nature. And evolution as an idea in science is an established fact. There is no argument that evolution occurs, and there is essentially no argument that the primary mechanism for evolution is natural selection. Like all areas of science, there are people sorting out the details, and that's true in evolution too. But there is as much confidence in evolution by natural selection as there is in other fundamental theories in science, like atomic theory in chemistry and gravitational theory in physics. And what those two theories have going for them is that they did not create any controversy with established beliefs, but evolution did make people question beliefs. And so this idea that it's just a theory has become a part of the struggle that scientists have with talking about and explaining natural selection. All right, you all watched the video, so I'm going to click very quickly through some slides that document some of the things that were discussed in the video about Darwin and his voyage. When he was on the different continents and islands that the Beagle visited on the voyage, he was able to see plants and animals that no other scientist had ever seen before. No other scientist had ever seen in terms of the totality of the diversity of plants and animals. And he also got to see a lot of fossils, and that was also highlighted in the opening scenes of that video. And so looking at those fossils was also very eye-opening for Darwin. Not only that there were species that looked very much unlike anything alive on the Earth today, but also there were species and fossils that he found in places that were very unexpected. Fossils of sea creatures, of aquatic organisms, high in the Andes. The Galapagos were a particularly important experience for Darwin, not only at the time, but more importantly in retrospect, when he was able to reflect on all that he had seen and learned. He went back to the experience that he had in the Galapagos and the observations that he made there of the plants and animals. And it really catalyzed some of his thinking about the changes that must have taken place to result in the diversity of animals that he saw on the different islands. Ultimately, what Darwin concluded was that the groups of similar but distinct species that lived on those islands probably got there originally from the nearest continent, and that's South America. And that it was likely that those first migrants, those first inhabitants of their type that lived on those newly formed volcanic islands would have had multiple sort of ecological opportunities available to them because there weren't competing species. And so those original colonizers wound up adapting to different roles in their environment. And through the course of time, adapted to those different niches, those different roles in the environment, and also to the slightly different habitats that existed on the different islands. Darwin was a very well-read. He was a gentleman of leisure, so he had the opportunity to read. He was very well-read and interested in other areas of science, and he was very much influenced by geology and what was the new idea of geology, that the Earth goes through long, slow, gradual processes to change the surface of the Earth, that mountains grow slowly, that valleys are cut by rivers slowly, that wind and water can erode rock very slowly. And given enough time, given the huge amounts of time in geologic history, these slow, gradual processes could make very dramatic changes on the surface of the Earth. This really impressed Darwin in thinking about the changes that may have taken place in the living world. And it influenced Darwin's thinking that perhaps dramatic changes, such as animals evolving into very different and distinct species, could happen incrementally if given enough time for slow, gradual processes to take place. One other thing, real quick before I wrap up this video, Darwin was not the first person to talk about or to propose a mechanism for evolution. Lots of other scientists and natural historians had observed what Darwin had observed about, the diversity of life on Earth and the possibility that life may have changed over time. And one of the early theories that was influential to Darwin, because he thought that the theory had value, was one proposed by a French naturalist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And he thought that organisms evolved over time and adapted to their environments. That would explain why species are well adapted to their environment, that they change over time to become adapted to their environment. Lamarck's proposition was that species, and it's a very attractive proposition. Like, his idea is that if species try to strive more or less to survive in their environment, they will develop traits that help them be better adapted. And over the course of their lifetime, they can develop slightly better adaptations by trying to fit into the environmental role that they play in their particular habitat. And it's a very attractive idea because it's this notion that, hey, we're going to work hard and do our best and strive and get a little bit better, and then we'll pass that on to our offspring. And there's often a giraffe analogy given to explain Lamarckian evolution. There's an original short-necked giraffe. It stretches and stretches to reach the leaves on trees so that it has plenty of food. And as a giraffe stretches and stretches during its lifetime, its neck becomes a little bit longer, and it passes on that longer neck to its offspring. Well, Lamarck knew nothing about genetics and how traits are passed on to offspring. Neither did Darwin. And if they would have known that this theory was flawed from the beginning, that organisms do not change genetically in their lifetime, and it's the genetic inheritance that is by far the most important for what will determine the traits of the offspring. The next couple of slides have another example, Fiddler crabs. And I will let you look at those slides and read those bits by looking at the PowerPoint, because that's enough for one video for one day, I think. Please jot down any notes that you think are interesting, jot down any questions that you have, and of course write down any ideas that you think are important.